This video is about Wampum Woo. And we're going to tie in together all kinds of stuff. So get your heads all ready to be twisted up. It is a video provided for by circumstance. The circumstances being an interview that I had scheduled, had to postpone, and then suddenly found the time available, but not able to connect with the interviewer. And so I'm using the time to discuss current events going on up north of us here in Canada. And these current events are related to native peoples, tribal people, and they relate to wampum. Everything does. All of life relates to wampum. And in fact, the Chinese have a saying, wampum is life. Only in their term, they call it money. Money is life, because wampum is money. And the events going on up north, in case you haven't heard about it, is that they're burning churches on indigenous land and throughout Canada. And they're pulling down statues of the royals and getting themselves worked up into a very un-Canadian-like mental state as a result of the discovery of yet more graves of indigenous children at these religious schools. Okay, these were institutions that had done great horrors to the indigenous people in Canada. And that's it's sort of what we're talking about, is colonization, right? And so we'll start off and we'll define some terms here, and we'll see where we can get. I've only got about a little over an hour, so we'll see if we can get it all done. It's hugely complex. So it involves war, it involves Europe, it involves the Americas, Asia, technologies, money, as I stated, religion, the Pope's all up in there. There we go. Let's start with the Pope. Okay, so 2 years after Columbus hit Hispaniola, that's what he named the island he landed on, which is in the Caribbean. It's a little spit of not very much of land. I mean, it's a little tiny place. It's 2 years after that, in 1494, we have this meeting in Tordesillas, I think. Tordesillas, yes. Okay, so we have this meeting. It's in Spain. D-E-S-I-L-L-A-S. It's the Treaty of Tordesillas. I'm saying it wrong. I have code switching issues, right? Because I was speaking different languages earlier this morning, so I'm not even going to hardly be able to speak English, let alone say anything in Espanol correctly, right? So you'll have to forgive me as we go forward here. There was this meeting here between the Pope, and I forget which Pope, I don't care which Pope it was, and these two kings. It is not important to me the name of the personalities that occupied the roles, all right? So we had a Pope, and we had two kings. The kings were the kings of Spain and Portugal, and this occurred in 1494. It evolved from 1494 over the better part of like 2 or 3 decades as it was ratified by the various parties and things happened, okay? And in 1492, you remember, Columbus and his crew landed in Hispaniola here in the New World and reported, and then they went back and they reported back to their backers, the royals in Spain, and the word got around that, yeah, they found something. Now, they knew they were going to find something. It was not unknown. They had maps. They just didn't know what specifically they would find when they got there. All right, but they knew that the place existed. They actually had decent maps of the Americas. And they knew the route. They knew the approximate sailing time. So this was not a, sailing off and hoping you weren't going to sail off the edge of the world kind of a thing. In any event, so we get back to Tordesillas here. In 1494, the Pope is in a situation where he wants to stop a war. Okay, he's already got one war brewing and going, which is this war with the northern religious part of Europe, because they were getting uppity and wanted to break away for all different kinds of reasons, leading up to Luther and the Reformation and so on. But it was all basically, it was all power politics between the Pope and the northern kings and tribal leaders. England, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, that kind of thing, right? And France was off on its own thing. France was just its own problem for the Pope, because that's where the Cathars were. Huge center of Gnosticism, of a specific kind of Gnosticism. The Cathars were a very interesting, unique social order, the only remnants of which I'm aware of in Europe still are the Basque peoples. In any event, the Pope has this problem. King of Spain and the King of Portugal are pissed at each other because they've each got a lot of money, they're very powerful empires, and they're going off colonizing. They're going to go off and colonize. And they're getting pissed at each other because Spain's claiming all of the Americas and what they know of them. And Portugal's claiming it. And so they're both claiming the same properties. And basically what the Pope did was to decide, let's cut it in half, dudes. You each be satisfied with what I give you. And so what he did was to slice the world, and there was this weird thing about the cross, okay? So I'll try and draw it very crudely. Okay, so if this is Europe, that's England, and then this is the coastline of Europe, come into Gibraltar, and there's the Mediterranean and stuff, and there's Africa right there. Then over here we would have the Americas. There's Florida, and there's the Central America, and we're getting into South America. And it's just all squiggly places. What he did was, from that place in Spain, was that he drew a cross on a map, because they didn't have a globe at the time. And he started with the vertical line just off of the Cape Verde Islands. And actually it was on the other side of the Azores specifically. And then he drew a cross like that basically was trying to be equatorial, and he decided on how the empires would split up this new area over here, right? And so he assigned certain regions to Spain and to Portugal. And Spain and the Portuguese were the kings of the two countries, were happy. Oh, okay, we're going to get a shitload of gold, we're fine, right? So that all is good. All right, so that was in 1494. And so at that point, we have the dominant power in the dominant power in the non-Chinese part of the planet. No, it's not. It's much more complex than that. Okay, so the dominant players in Europe at that point were controlled by the Pope. The Pope had an army, he had allegiance from all of these people, he was a power politics player, so even though he didn't have a very big country, because he's just sitting in the Vatican, this, a little tiny spot within even the smallest spot of the Seven Hills of Rome, and he didn't have a big army, what he did have was the momentary self-supporting allegiance of all of these various kings with their armies. So for instance, if the Portuguese decided that, or later on when the British decided to go Protestant, he sicked the French on them, right? And then he sicked the Spaniards on them. And so they fought the English. Yeah, it was all said because of the religion, but basically it was because the English were trying to get away from the sway of the Pope, from the power of the Pope. And so at that point, the Pope put his assets, his agents, the other kings, and their armies. So it was this huge power pyramid, at the very top of which was the Pope. Now, there were other power pyramids on the planet at that time, including the great empires in all along the coast here of the Americas, but especially centered in Central and South America. The Mesoamerican, Central American, North American Incas and so on, and then down in Aztecs, and then down in through the Incas in Peru. And so these were huge empires, spanned great distance. There was also a giant empire out in the South Pacific that no one in this area here even knew about, and that was the Polynesian Empire, the Mini Islands Empire. They owned land spread across oceans, but it was nonetheless larger than, it was like a third of the planet at that point, and that they actually traversed. And it was a very large empire. We had empires that were small. We had empires that, were just like the Maori Empire was restricted to New Zealand. You had the Chinese and so on. But this was the time in which all of these large aggregations of humans were in these power pyramids that were structured in empiric ways that were all vying for competition to be top dog on the planet of empires. That's what this was at that time, was the planet of empires. Now, at the time that this occurred in 1494, bear in mind, 2 years earlier, Columbus comes on over here. So let's see if we can do this. He's not a green guy, but we can leave that. But anyway, okay, so Columbus sails out of the Med, sails on over, he lands in the Caribbean. Okay, that's 1492. At that time, it's estimated that there were 60 million native peoples up here in the Americas, North and Central. So it wouldn't include South America down there. And down in here, it was estimated there were 200 millions of peoples in South America. And we know, for instance, that in one small area, now there's 200 million, these are outside estimates, okay? So if you go and you look at the anthropology and you look at population studies and any of this shit on the internet, it's all guesses. Nobody knows. There was no census or anything. They're just estimates based on reasonable populations and reports of the time. So we have reports from 1495 and 96 and these kind of things that were written up at that time about the visit to the islands here and what they learned. And we have 15, I think there was another expedition in the 1525 period that brought back tons of information about population. And that's where we get the upper estimate of 200 millions in South America. Now we know historically that in the area called Amazonia, the actual rainforest, that we have, we can see now with overflights, looking down through the forest, we can see stone structures and foundations and stuff that have been dated as having been abandoned or the population died off in the early 1500s. So up through 1560s, up through 1570s, there was a mass die-off in Amazonia. And what they're referring to is this area that basically it's the floodplain, the Amazon River, that runs all throughout this big chunk of South America. And they know that the structures that they can see up in this little region up in here would have supported 20 million people. So there were cities there that are now totally overgrown by Amazonian jungles. And the guys that are clearing land for cows or whatever, they're still growing soybeans, whatever the fuck they're doing, they will occasionally stumble on some of these cities and suburbs and find vast areas that are basically foundations. Or street structures. They didn't build a lot in stone, but they built foundations in a rainforest of stone, and they lived on these short stone foundations in what was presumed to have been some kind of a wood or other structure. And the stones were, they served a public purpose. So there was no real expectation that people were making houses out of stone, but there were a number of stone structures and foundations there. And the population estimates were 20 million, the ones I've read most recently. And I would buy that because of other things that were written in the 1500s from people that were coming back from Da Gama and all of these other expeditions by the Spanish and the Portuguese to this region. And they were astounded by the number of people that they encountered. There was one thing I read that it was written by a monk. He was with, I'm trying to think, I'll get it wrong, I'm certain, but one of the guys that came and they went into the Inca nation, and this monk died about a third of the way into the voyage, or into the expedition here. And his journal was picked up and carried on sometime later. So in other words, he dies like 1 year, and then a year later, there's somebody else who meets up with him, or for whatever reason, picks up that journal and begins writing. So we have two different minds corresponding here. When the guy picks up the journal and begins writing, he says, I'm picking up the journal of Friar so-and-so of such and such and such and such and such an order, and I'm taking it forward from this point on. I don't remember any of the details about the religious order that this friar had been in, this recording monk. That was his job. He was a recording monk. He was to record the details of the expedition. Anyway, though, but that first recording monk who died way up early in their expedition when they first hit Central America, and they had been moving down into South America by coastal excursion in boats, they came across a very large path, which we would think of as a road, and it was not worn the way their roads were, so they didn't describe it that way because all their roads were destroyed by horses, and so they didn't recognize a very wide augmented natural road for basically human and livestock traffic. But in any event, they came across a city that the friar estimated that there were 50,000 people living in. And he said, at that time, that was the largest city that he had ever been in, and he had been in the great city of Cadiz, in Spain. So, and Cadiz at that time that he had been there had 30,000 people, and this monk was floored by that. And here was what had been described to them was a very small outpost of this very long empire in the south, and this small outpost had 50,000 people. And the friar writes in his book that he was not going to put down the blasphemous numbers that were provided to him by the heathen priests, because he knew that they were lies from the devil. But basically, what he's saying is that the Indian priest, the Native American priest down here, told him the size of the empire and the size of some of the cities, and his mind was so totally blown, he couldn't conceive of it, and so thought it a lie of the devil. And they probably told him, oh yeah, we've got cities with 500,000 people, or maybe 1 million people in them. Bear in mind that the Mesoamericans were really into numbers. They counted shit, and the Incas had census. They those rulers knew how many potatoes they grew each year. They were very good administrators, those guys. Anyway, so in 1494, the Pope splits up the planet between these guys, and between the two kings of Spain and Portugal, and then they start the colonization effort. And that is going to lead us to wampum, razors, and royals. How? Well, here's the thing. Later on, not too much later on, England gets into tussles with these guys as well as France, because England is pushing back on the Pope and didn't get any part of this deal. England got left out. They're really pissed, as are the Germans. But the Germans are their own issue. Anyway, though, so the royals from England decide they're going to go and colonize America on their own and screw it, right? But it's all basically, no matter how we look at it, it was from a pyramid, a power pyramid, that the whole colonization effort that was like formalized in this treaty that split the planet between the Spanish and the Portuguese kings in 1494 was a power pyramid play thing, right? And so up here at the top, we have the Pope. The Pope has its own agenda. Then we have the kings, all royalty. They have their own agenda. And then we have the basically the very thin middle class, and then we'll have like a warrior class, and then everybody else. But this power pyramid was, okay, so the pyramid is or can be described as being pushed or directed by religion. Okay, because that was their stated goal. That, in my opinion, the Pope was using religion to cover a pure power play. These guys are not nice people, as we know. And so the Pope was using the religion in order to motivate all of these people here, especially all of these guys who have to actually do the fighting and dying at the behest of everybody else up there. And so this is the suffering masses here. We can just say that. And that's basically all of us guys, right? Anyway, so 1494, planet is split in half, and we got real problems from that point on. That is a huge marker for near-term modern issues, right? Because it formalized colonization and made it acceptable for everybody from this layer down to pursue what, what basically is not a good policy, right? Moving into somebody's territory and then killing them and taking it over. That's not a good policy. Now, here's what we have to acknowledge. If we're going to deal with all of this shit, unlike the Wokians and unlike everybody else, we've got to be realistic and adult. We've got to speak about these things as adults and deal with the underlying motivations and all of that as deep as we can until we can come to a level of resolution that makes us understand the motivations and where everybody fit into this. Because everybody's fucking guilty or no one is guilty. We're all innocent or everybody is evil. And it just depends on your perspective. Here, from our perspective, now we think we're out of the world of the royals and colonization and all of that, which is bullshit. But the suffering masses think that they're elevated above the royals and that the Pope has no real power and all of that bullshit. But now that we're at that world, we're trying to apply our morality to shit that happened in the past, and we can't do that. We have to look at it factually and openly, with putting ourselves in the mindset of the people at the time. We don't have to excuse their actions, right? Immorality is still immorality, regardless of what age it's practiced in. But what is immoral in each age radically differs. And for us to use our moral compass against their times is absurd, because we're not walking in their shoes. We don't know what they really faced. Now, so they took actions that we would consider immoral, but they would just have considered practical or whatever, right? Now, but nonetheless, we have to live in this age with our condition, with us and all of our history, and we've got to reconcile it. This is why I like the idea that the space alien stuff is starting to break open a lot of the restrictions and the lid that's been clamped down on everything, because sooner than later we shall receive more and more information about our true history. And then things are going to get really weird, because it goes back way further than this, and it's going to set all of officialdom up on its head, spin them upside down and bounce them around a bunch, just because it's so fucking weird. And even those guys in officialdom now who have been weirded out by the space aliens have no fucking idea what we're really going to get into, okay? Now, I have to point something out here, that in this all giant power pyramid, you're always going to find a group out here that is outsiders, okay? And they're just outsiders. And they don't participate in any of this, but a lot of these guys that are outsiders, for whatever reason, like the Cathars, who are not power-oriented, or the Jain, they record, they write. And so we get a lot of our information from the outsiders who were not, and we get a lot of the information from the insiders because they didn't hide anything. They said, oh yeah, we've got to go conquer these heathens, right? And they have to die, surrender as slaves, or flee. That's the only options because, you know, we've got God on our side and we're going to go and conquer. And that's the way it was. It was the, you know, like in one point there was a God-driven continental imperative, you know, we shall hold this whole continent. We've got to get to the Pacific, you know, and all of this, so that the nascent English-speaking population there at some point realized they had to conquer the rest of the continent or face repercussions from other groups that would try and conquer the same continent they were conquering, and that would be no good. And so, you know, this is just the way it was during that period of time, and to look at it any other way, I understand that you kids don't get real interesting discussions of history, so you don't know a lot of the facts, let alone the flow of how it all happened relative to the emotions and who stood where and which roles and so on. And it's quite fascinating, all of this sort of stuff, right? Especially when you get your head around and you disregard what you're told by schooling and you go look it up and research it yourself and form your own opinion. So I had an interesting thing where here I was, an American kid. I go to the, as part of the occupation forces of Germany. Okay, so the Americans supposedly, and the French and everybody, they conquered Germany in World War II, and we're going to occupy them so that they can't be fierce and start back up again. And so we ship our soldiers over there to keep them put down. Sooner or later, things calm down, and the soldiers get to wanting normality, and so they start bringing over wives and families. And so I was one of the families that got brought over to the occupation forces because my dad was stationed over there. And so I got into Europe in the 60s during this weird period of time for Europe. In any event, though, so all right, so this splits off into so many different ways. So as our history goes in terms of conquering and this kind of thing. So I actually, as a kid in the 1960s, encountering Europe, there were no American schools at the time I got there, so I was pushed off to a British school because the British had a school set up, and I got to be educated by people who usually taught the royals. And so I had a terrible, terrible time because I did not give a shit which William did what to what other William, right, in terms of kings. I didn't care who was I didn't care, you know, roses and all of their problems and the various different republics versus the short-lived republics versus the royals in England, the Windsors, the Germanic connections, all of this weird shit. I wanted it out of my head. It was just nothing to me, and it was all about the royals, and I didn't care about them. And it was all really ugly stuff too. You know, they were always fighting each other and doing dirty deeds to each other and to the general population. They were not nice guys, and I didn't much want to spend all of my time studying them. But it was just weird because these Brits were just fucking obsessed with this shit. Now later on, I come to realize it's the total control of the education system, the schooling system by the royals that makes them obsessed with it, but they're not. I don't think there's really that many of them that are truly obsessed with it. Anyway, so history is a strangeness that has to be understood at a personal level, and we have to understand it in the context of our own relationship to our own history and that which will follow us, right? And so misinterpretation is guaranteed, and so we just have to accept it and go on and get at things and see really what sense we can make of things. And so now we get back to, okay, so all of this is driven by power. And power in our societies has an abstract, which is money. Money is an encapsulation of power. If you have money, you can walk somewhere and do something. That used to be restricted, the ability to do something like, you know, I don't know, walk over and stay at a place down the road and pay for it. That used to be was really restricted only to the royals. And then as power started being distributed further and further and further down the power pyramid, it became encapsulated because it was easier to give people money than it was to give them a slave or a chunk of land or something like this. So we abstracted it into money, and these guys were doing that as we go on down here. And at some point it dawns on everybody that, oh, money is a thing of its own, and I don't have to get it from the Pope or my own personal royalty. I can sail over to that other country, bash somebody on the head, take his money, bring it back here, and I will have everything I want within my own society, which is basically, land, good food, long life, women, that sort of thing, right? So, it's to satisfy our own fundamental social needs. And then we abstract on top of it, we end up with popes and royalty and all of this kind of stuff where they have organization and institutions that are trying to survive. And then we think of the institution, the government, the church, whatever the fuck it is, as something that lives on its own, that makes decisions on its own. The church decided to do this, the church decided to do that, the church decided to let the Pope split the planet in half, and and so on, right? Now, the Pope was not stupid when he split the planet in half to the King of Spain and Portugal. Those guys had to pony up. They had to do shit. So he got a piece of the action. He was guaranteed a certain amount of revenue out of the new territories, out of the new lands, and that revenue included human trafficking. All right. So once it was known from Columbus that the state of the natives here was abysmal and heathenistic, even though there were millions of the fuckers, once that was known, a certain set of decisions was made in 1493. We know that they were made because we're conspiracy freaks and we can go back into history. We've lived in Europe and we really understood how history is stored in all these various ledgers. And so we can go through and we can look at history and we can find out that in 1493 there was a pre-meeting meeting between the King of Spain and the Pope in which they discussed and derived and decided upon methods for colonization, methods for the warfare. And there were documents that were written about it. Mostly the documents you'll find are dated like 1496 and so on, but they will reference journals and things that were written in 1493. You'll find these all over actually, because there were a lot of people paying attention to this, right? So the Brits were really paying attention to this shit going down. They had their own problems at the time, but there was a cadre of Brit royals that were aware of this, and they had their spies in Europe that were getting them information about it. So you find some of it in English, not very much. Most of it's written in Church Latin and in Portuguese, and then some in the Spanish. The Spanish information was scattered and destroyed to a great degree in the Spanish Civil War that preceded World War II. A lot of it was damaged in World War II as well. The Portuguese, being somewhat neutral not involved in the Spanish Civil War that way, they were just an entree for people to go and fight. But the Portuguese were basically a neutral island in World War II. They weren't bombed and so they didn't lose these historic repositories, mainly in the churches, right? In any event, so you find that there are documents that talk about the result of the King of Spain and his, we would think of him as like his head of the Joint Chiefs and the head of his military. And they went and discussed things with the Pope, and a plan was devised, and it was settled, and this led to the treaty in 1494 in which the Pope split the planet in half. Now, this plan was entirely act of war, weapon of mass destruction. And it was not new, it was not even novel. It had been practiced by the Turkoman Empire on the Byzantines and on the Persians, who we now call Iranians, and on the some group in what we now think of as Lebanon. Okay, so the Turkoman Empire, what later became the Ottoman Empire, fought the Byzantine Empire for well over 100 years and then defeated the Byzantine Empire by a particular weapon of mass destruction that they also used on the Persian Empire and they also used on the Middle East. And this weapon of mass destruction was smallpox and other diseases. Okay, the Turkomans were really good about that. What later became the Ottoman Empire. These were fierce people, they were smart, they were aggressive, they were expansive at that time, they needed more lands, more resources, and so they came in collision to the more established Byzantine Empire and Persian Empire that surrounded them, and they conquered both. And one of the ways they did it was this weapon of mass destruction that was elevated to basically perfection by the Spanish, and that was biowarfare, or disease as a weapon. So this is current, right? So this gets us back to COVID. So this is nothing new. Biowarfare, COVID hitting us, you know, the CCP designing it, building it, that kind of shit. Absolutely nothing new. They've been doing it since they decided to do it in 1493. They decided to do it against all of the Americas. They were going to kill off everybody in the Americas. They knew that that the approach they were taking, left alone, would kill 90% of all of the people, and they wouldn't have to fuck with them. And they knew it because they had a disease package. And what they did was, on the expeditions here, they shipped blankets and artifacts that had been deliberately contaminated. These blankets and artifacts were not like trash or anything. They were the best that they had. They were intended to be offered to the priests and the royals in these empires right here. But these blankets and artifacts had been contaminated deliberately with body extracts from people that had died from the plague and smallpox and other diseases. We don't really know the total cocktail that they put together. But this is a known thing, that the King of Spain and the Pope put together a biological warfare plan against the Americas, against the indigenous population of the Americas. They did it in 1493. It was formalized in 1494. It had been launched between 1494 and 1525. And by the late 1500s, this entire population down here, 20 million people, had died in Amazonia, because Amazonia, being so humid, really spread the disease, and there was just, it was estimated that 99% of the people died. The natives over here had no resistance against these diseases. It's also thought that just the contact of Columbus's crew here caused such a disease outbreak in gonorrhea, syphilis, dozens of other contact transmitted diseases, that alone may have accounted for as much as half the damage that was done to the North American population. And so by the time that the British came on over here, that 60 million was estimated to have been cut down to well under 19 million. So by that time, that would have, so by the 1600s, let's just put it that way, we go from 60 million down to 19 million, and then it gets cut down even more so in the 1600s and the 1700s. Again, frequently by simply contact with people that carrying disease that is hardened, their bodies were hardened to, but the native population, the indigenous population, was not. All right, so now we need to take a little diversion to razors. So this is in our little crude map up here. This is Alaska, actually, that goes on up like that. Up here is Vancouver Island. And, you know, I can't see it from where I live, but if I could get high enough here relatively, I could see it fairly quick, because it's not that far away. It's, you know, what? It's 10, 12 hours by car probably, going through traffic and shit. But it's only about 500 miles or so. But on Vancouver Island is a very particular kind of a razor, and it's a razor clam. And these are really cool razor clams because they grow their shells in a very interesting way. They're mono shell razor clams. All right, so they're not bivalves. They don't have bivalves. They're technically a bivalve because there's a little tiny part of their shell that does have a valve, but basically they grow their shell in a tube. And it's like a long, thin tube, and the razor clam lives inside it. Now, as a practical thing, most people will never encounter these razor clams. They're very difficult to get to. On Vancouver Island, you've got to dive for them. They live in a very steep part of the low part of the tidal zone. So they're not really that exposed that frequently, but they're really tasty. And if you get them, you just take these things and put them on hot rocks, and they cook real quick, and you can just eat them real easily. And the shells are really cool. Now, every one of probably everybody here that has ever seen a Western movie in which there were indigenous people running around probably has seen some of these shells as is depicted by Hollywood. And frequently they will depict these shells arranged in breastplates. And there's a central string that goes down, and then the shells are arrayed out in long things down. And there's never any explanation as to why the Indian people would wear the razor clam shells around, especially the Southwest or up in here in the Atlantic, why they would wear the razor clams as breastplates, right? But you see it all throughout the Southwest, all the way in the Northwest, all over the place. The tribal people have these breastplates of these shells. And the reason is that the shells are money. Okay, wampum means money. And the wampum we're talking about is these razor clam shells. And so they would wear these breastplates, not as armor, because obviously a razor clam shell was, a rock would break it, just flying up from your shoe. It's going to break very easily. And frequently you will see that they are indeed broken, that they're tied there, and that the thing that's holding them together is the string. But these breastplates are decorative ways of wearing wealth, because the wampum was the medium of exchange for these 60 million people that lived up here. We find wampum got all the way down to Florida, it was all the way up into Maine. And that these razor clams are only found in Vancouver Island. It was their scarcity and their uniqueness, the way that they are produced, and that they're not an apparent bivalve, that made them unique, that led over some course of time for them to be adopted as money, as the medium of exchange here. And it was convenient for them, not for the native people. They didn't have banks. There was no razor clam shell bank. And so they would string them up. And they were nomadic people, so you'd string them up and you'd wear them. And so thus they were wearing these breastplates, which they were wearing those the same way as Indian women, like Hindu women over here in India, wear gold today. All right, it's because they don't trust the banks. They want to have their wealth with them, and there are times where ceremoniously you would wear that to show your status in the community. And so that's where wampum comes from. Boy, a long history lesson here to get to the suffering masses. Okay, so it's all about money, right? It's all about money. The invaders to this continent come on over here. They don't recognize wampum as being worth anything. These guys down here have a bunch of gold. These guys up here have precious stones. Those are worth something. These people here and these people here, or these people in the north, did not value the precious stones as much as they did the wampum, because it's hard to exchange stones, but the regular sizes of the razor clams, the fact that they could be graded, gave you a sense of a fungible kind of a money. And it worked that way. And you could get change and shit, right? It's difficult to do that with a handful of irregular, although, pretty semi-precious stones. Down here they had gold, that was much more easy, but the people down here did not use gold as a medium of exchange. They didn't have gold coins, they weren't minting it in that sense. So they had other mediums, mostly based around foods. But in any event though, so the invaders come on over here and they don't respect the monetary systems, but they still do like the gold and they do like the precious stones and silver. Another diversion there. Anyway though, so the power structure here, is basically a power play. They want to take over the whole world. They've got an abstraction here for money. They want to get the money from here as well as take over the world and have their colonies and this sort of thing. And here's where we come to today with all these churches being burned up in Vancouver or Canada, throughout Canada, on Canada Day, right? So not a good thing. It'd be like in the United States, I don't know, burning down something, strategic like that throughout the country on 4th of July, like going around burning down all the post offices or something. In any event, though, so they're burning down the churches because the indigenous peoples, they know what went down, right? They know who was at the seat, who sat there. They know what happened in 1493. I mean, I talk to my cousins. These are not stupid, uneducated people. They're aware of the whole history of this. The fact that they're not mainstream, the fact that they're a conquered, isolated, restricted on reservations peoples means that all us white guys, all of the brown people that are, out in the cities and stuff, we're not paying attention to what's happened to the indigenous people, right? They are isolated. But the indigenous people know exactly who is the seat of it. It is the Pope. Now there's this other weird wrinkle here, and that relates to Canada, and that relates to the English royals, because the English royals, they were the ones that colonized Canada up here. And so when they came over from England and took over Canada, again at Vancouver Island in Vancouver, BC, the current queen and her now dead husband kidnapped 10 indigenous children. It may have been more, 10 that I'm aware of, and took them back to England, and these people were never heard from again. Their lives were very short in the sense that I doubt they lasted a month in England or even 2 months. There was no record of them, and people in our current time in Canada who bring this issue up, where is my cousin? I saw you take him away in this year. It was, I don't remember if it was like 1954, so it was back in the 50s. I saw you take our cousins away then. Where are they? What happened to them? You bring that up, you get killed. There are indigenous people that have been killed in the last 20 years for bringing that issue up, and they were killed up here in BC because you can't bring that up. Now it's coming out, right? Now all this shit's coming out because now we're in the new age of Aquarius. It's now information, and there's the new energies from space. Everything's up in the air, and shit's going down, right? So at the moment, don't be surprised at what's going to happen in Canada. Don't be thinking, if you live here in the United States, that people toppling statues of the Queen are in any way reacting as leftist or communists or anything. None of the native people I know can stand communists. All right, they are communal people, and there's a big fucking difference in that they're all entrepreneurs, and a lot of these tribal people are very wealthy from their own work. They get out there with those fucking crab boats and risk their lives hauling crab in for you to have crab on your holiday, or they go out and get salmon, this kind of stuff. These are resource harvesters, and so these are tough, hard-thinking, practical people. And they hold grudges because, they got a lot of time to think about this shit. And so you go talk to them and you'll find out that I'm telling you what's going on. And so the people in Canada, the indigenous people in Canada, know that things are different now. And that now there is no fucking way that the white power structure, at the behest of the Pope or the royals, will in any way intrude on their outrage and outpouring of this several hundreds years war that they've had with the Pope. And all religious, all white religion is, all the conquering religion is the same to them. Doesn't matter if it's Protestant or Catholic, they're not going to differentiate because these schools were run by both and so on. And also they know that, the English speaking and so on. They're not really pissed at the French. French Catholic churches are going to go down because Catholics were the bad guys all throughout this. It's a kid fucker religion. It is a human trafficking religion. It is not a good thing. You can separate the religion from the organization, right? The organization is a hugely corrupt thing that's been corrupt since since ever. But we have clear evidence that it was corrupt in 1493 when it plotted to poison with disease a whole fucking continent. Now, true, disease has been used in war forever. The British used it all the time. They would throw bloated dead cows and bodies and stuff and put them on the trebuchets and fling them into castles, because then the people in there would have to handle them to get rid of them. And sometimes when they'd hit the ground, they would explode. They'd be so bloated with the disease that it would go everywhere and people would die from it. And so a lot of plague was, they would go and dig up plague bodies and pitch them over. So disease as a weapon is not new. We shouldn't expect this. We should be prepared for this. Nothing has changed. We're still under this power pyramid structure here that is not, in my opinion, not natural to humans. The CCP, the religion, the power structure of religions, all of these things emerge in they're not. Well, okay, so they're sort of an outgrowth of tribalism, tribes banding together. So in my opinion, what Temujin, we call him Genghis Khan, what he accomplished by binding all of the tribes of the Mongols together and creating an empire was an entirely different power structure than we see in any other empire. So he defeated the hierarchical power structure of the Chinese at the time, the hierarchical power structure of the Muslim world at the time. Any empire that came against him was defeated. The empires that came against him were all structured along this line. And his was he was a confederation. Confederations are natural organic structures for humans to work things out among themselves. Power structures set up on these power pyramids, in my opinion, are not. I personally believe these are intruded into our Earth reality. And we can now discuss that in a meaningful adult fashion, because we have officialdom saying, yeah, UFOs are real, they're coming here, they're not from here, we don't know what the fuck they are, and we're scared of them. Well, if all of those things are true, then we cannot say that they're not putting things into our own consciousness and directing humans en masse or individually through medium and mechanisms that we don't understand. We can't rule it out. To rule it out is foolish. But here we are in a situation now where we're having upheaval in Canada. We're dealing with the destruction of money again. So it's another wampum issue. We're still being colonized, only now we're being colonized by, all of us are being colonized by the CCP and its bioweapon. So that shit is still going on. It's 2021 and we're still doing shit that they did in 1493. This time the bioweapon is COVID, it's not the poxes, but it's still a colonization effort by the CCP and communism that wants to colonize the whole world. Only now the Pope is communistic and the royals are communistic. Oh, hey, it's still the same fuckers, right? Their New Green Deal, and all of this kind of shit. And what's really interesting is, if you look at it from my perspective, all of the shit they're trying to sell you is the tribal mindset. Okay, so if you look at how the subtle messages of the current power structures in the Western world, they elevate the indigenous population, although, technically in the Americas, there was no great invention out of any of these empires. We don't see that these empires were simply not inventive. They were cooperative and they were maybe harmonious to some extent, but they did slavery among themselves. There were wars among themselves across all of this area here in the indigenous population long before the buttheads from Europe came over, right? So they weren't different that way, but they were not as inventive, or were not as far along, or didn't have the penchant for inventing things technically. So we don't find the intellectual or technical equivalent empires in this part of the planet as we did there. That's why this part was more easily conquered and taken over. But that's now where we are at. where our society being conquered by the CCP? Well, it's well on its way. And is the CCP, are they their own masters? I don't think so. Actually, because I'm a woo-woo guy, I think there's space aliens involved up there somewhere, you know, directing the power pyramid down. But in any event, getting back to the Canadians and the churches and stuff, we're going to continue to have this go on because now, as I say, the energies are released. We're in the age of Aquarius. The indigenous population knows that there is a political upheaval and a cultural revolution going on, and their anger is coming out now in a way where they have demonstrable evidence to back up that anger that is so righteous that nobody's going to try and stop them. And at some point, and it might be a year from now, so maybe they'll be burning churches for a year. I don't think it'll go on that long. I think that there'll be a burst of this violence, and it'll continue through a hot summer as more and more shit comes out, as more secrets are revealed. But we'll still have a lot of these secrets being revealed over this next year. I think things will have changed relative to the tribal mindset by then. Now, getting back to the idea of that tribal mindset, if we look at the Green New Deal and everything, if we look at Klaus Schwab's you're going to own nothing, you're going to rent everything, and you're going to be happy. It's basically all of the things they're doing. They've abstracted the good parts of communalism, which is not communism. So they've abstracted the good parts of tribalism and are holding it up as a role, as an ethical model for all of the suffering masses to try and fix the planet. Now, the planet is safe. It'll always be here. It's been here billions of years before us. It'll be here billions of years after us. So you got to watch out for all this language. There's nothing to fix there other than these fuckers up at the top. And that's where we're at now. And so Canada, I'm looking for the place that sparks the revolution, right? I thought maybe it was going to be Ireland, but there may not be enough physical mass of people in Ireland to do it. And so maybe it'll be in Canada, and maybe it will turn in Canada and the revolution will begin. Now, this revolution will be unlike anything we've ever seen on this planet because it will not be confined to national borders, but it's not going to be exported. Previous revolutions, like the color revolutions and stuff, those were exported, but they were always confined to national borders. This one, when it sparks, if it sparks in Canada, that's fine, but wherever it does spark, it will not be confined to national borders, because it is not a case of the populace versus the state they live in. Okay, it won't be exported, but it'll go global. And it is a case of the suffering masses having decided that this top third of the pyramid has to go. The power part of it has to go. That we need a global confederation, that humans don't like living in power pyramids, and we're not going to restructure it, and we're not going to have this one that is there now. Now, the royals, in all of their greatness all over the place, are trying to restructure the power pyramid and redo from the middle class downward, right? They're saying to all of the suffering masses, oh, we're going to redo all of this stuff here, and you're going to all, rent everything, own nothing, and you'll be happy. Well, okay, but it doesn't change any of the shit for them. They're just simply trying to restructure everything down. We're wise to this. We ain't going to have it. It's just not going to happen. And so, we'll see royals. I don't know if we'll haul them out and kill them or anything, but, and that would be the safe thing to do, because then you don't have the bloodline, but you'd have to kill all of their kin and all of this kind of stuff, just to make sure that some wacky doodle 200 years from now doesn't claim to be the true king of England and get a big thing going. But I don't care about that so much. But we're going to get rid of the royals. We're going to bust up all these institutions. The financial stuff is going to bust up on its own as we go through the breakdown of the current form of wampum, which is the fiat currencies, right? The dollar and the euro. And the won and all of these. The fiat currencies are going to bust up and fall apart, and just like the wampum currency died when not enough people were around to sustain it. And you got to think about it, for them to harvest shells here in this one spot in Vancouver Island, and then for them to make it all the way down there, they got to be harvesting a lot of those damn shells. And also, you've got to have some way of transporting it across that country. So it was going hand to hand clear across the nation, and who knows for how long. There's no clear understanding of how long the wampum system existed. It could have gone for several hundreds of years, 400 or 500 or 600 years, as an effective system of trade before there were any kind of recording people here. We do know that as the reputed Chinese expedition that landed on the coast over here in California, near San Francisco Bay, the reputed Chinese, because they don't officially talk about it. There's one that was in the 1500s, the Lost Chinese Expedition, but there was another one there that was like, I want to say it was like maybe 400 or 500 AD. So that one was not discussed. It's known. There's a few books that mentioned it. It's more or less accepted as a historical fact, even though there isn't much there in terms of historical data around it. But there is a representation from there in some text of shell money, beads and shell money. And so, and we know that when as an aside also, that the English knew to bring shells and beads to trade. So this was a common understanding that this was the money system in this continent. And so they got their beads and their shells in Europe, and they brought them over to trade. Now their shells were rejected because they weren't wampum. It was kind of like trying to pass counterfeit. But their beads were accepted, and they got the whole island of Manhattan for them or someplace, right? So anyway. Now, there's no reason to, as I was saying, there's no reason to be shocked about the COVID being used as a method of colonization. That ever since 1493, we know that they use this to clear out whole continents, and so someone's attempting to do that to us, right? Now they're attempting to colonize us. So we will see more examples of this kind of discussion about what's going on popping out over the next probably month and a half or 2 months. So you can watch for that. You can watch for some people actually getting down and saying, what's going to happen, the social order breakdown, have we been vaxxed, has the Americans and most of the Western world been vaxxed out of existence, these sort of things. Because it really is potentially very severe in terms of the impact on our social order. The collapse from 19 million down to the remnants of the population here when the settlers came in, the colonists came in from England, was extremely rapid. They think it took like maybe 40 or 50 years for the first wave of the disease to go through, and then the second wave also, but then the third wave, they think it took out that last population very much more rapidly. And curiously, because there were fewer people there, the disease areas were concentrated. Unlike the supposition as to how disease spreads and it kills the host and it breaks it down. All right, I think that covered it all. Anyway, so we're looking at the current breakdown of the fiat system, just like the wampum system broke down. We have disease, just like they put disease here. And as I say, are we in this process of being colonized? And if I were space aliens, I would use, the local populace to do all of my dirty work for me. And so that might make a lot of sense. But in our future here, over these next couple of months, we're going to see a lot more stuff out of Canada, a lot more discussion of the evils of the royals, the evils of the colonization, and we're going to see a response against the current evils of the power structure bequeathed to the Canadians by the royals. Okay, so the Canadians have never decided that they wanted that power structure. There was a revolution in the United States. The Canadians stayed out of it, and there was never a deliberate decision on their part. They were mind controlled, because that's probably the best way to think about it. Their paradigm was structured, and they sort of acquiesced and accept that they would be the loyalists, and their loyalists moved in there after they got kicked out of the brouhaha in the 48 states, well, in the 13 colonies. And so Canada sort of, in my crude way of saying it, drifted into the form of government that they have now, which is part of this Commonwealth. And it is a structure in which they still are the suffering masses, and it's not the Pope, but the Queen is at the top, and all of the other royals are running, ruling over everything, right? And so now we'll see how the Canadians are going to react to this as more information comes out. But I suspect that it's going to be very, 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 very hot, and we're going to get one of these countries. Might even be the United States. I don't think so. But one of these countries that will have a revolution specifically against the power elite. And then that's going to start it off everywhere. We're doing it here in the United States now. We're doing it deliberately, slowly, legally, and pursuing all these legal remedies against the ruling power elite and the corrupt masses above us. And we, as the populace, will succeed. There's simply no question about it, because there's too many millions of us, hundreds of millions of us, that if we all keep walking step by step by step, there we go, we arrive at the goal. So I see that my crews are here now, and I've got to get moving. But we're doing land stuff here that we can do, in spite of the fire restrictions. Anyway, it's going to be an interesting little while. Cryptos are going to go up. We've got some FOMO coming. It'll more towards the end of July than the first part here. But also that can be said of the problems in the revolution and so on. Change in August, so Canada will go through a really nasty period here in July, and we will start understanding that, it's not leftist, it's not Antifa pulling down the statues, attacking government buildings, that sort of thing. It is, true aggrieved outrage and citizenry that has just had it, and they're going to make decisions. Now, I don't know if Canada will be the point. Maybe it'll be England. Maybe England will start pulling down all of the bizarre Illuminati statues, the dragons, and all of this kind of shit. And once we start seeing that, it's on. Anyway, guys, I got to go. The trucks are